one reads, suppose two sets of test scores have the same mean but different standard deviations, sigma 1 and sigma 2, with sigma 2 greater than sigma 1. Which statement best describes the variability of these data sets? So in question number 1, we've been assessed as to how to draw a connection between the standard deviation of two data sets, the concept of mean, and also the term of the size of variability. Alrighty, so before we answer this question, let's go ahead and do a real quick refresher on the measures of variability that we have in statistics. Okay, alright, so let's review that real quick. It's important that you know all of them. So recall, concerning the measures of variability, you're going to remember that there are 4 of them, okay? The first one is the range. So if you're thinking about a data set that's comprised of scores, for example, the range would basically be the highest score minus the lowest score. Okay, so highest minus lowest. That's the range of the data set. So this is one measure of variability. Another measure of variability is the interquartile range. Okay, so the next one is the interquartile range. This is another measure of variability. So if you want to calculate the interquartile range, all you just simply do is subtract the first quartile from the third quartile, okay? Or think about the difference between the 75th and the 25th percentiles. If you compute that difference, that will give you the interquartile range. All right. The third measure of variability is the variance. All right. And the variance is just simply the degree of spread of the scores in this context. So degree of spread of the scores. And then lastly, we have the standard deviation. Standard deviation. The standard deviation is similar to the variance, but the standard deviation refers to the spread of the scores from the mean. Okay, so that's another measure of variability. So it's the spread of the scores from the mean. So this basically helps us to answer the question that we're going to be working on. All right, so another point to keep in mind, something to note, is the relationship between the standard deviation and the magnitude of the variability. So something to note concerning the standard deviation, one of the 4 measures of variability that we have, and the variability of the data set. One thing you want to note is that there is a direct variation between these two. Okay, they vary directly with each other. So what does that mean? So the standard deviation varies directly with what? Varies directly with the size of the variability. Okay, so all that basically means is that if you have a greater standard deviation value, so if you have a greater sigma value, that automatically implies that you're going to have a greater variability. That's what direct variation means. And then the reverse is also the case. If you have a smaller standard deviation, smaller sigma value, you're going to have smaller variability. That's because the spread of the data set from the mean is smaller. All right? So in this particular case, we know that the standard deviation of data set 2 is greater than the standard deviation of data set 1. Okay, so what does that automatically tell us concerning concerning how their variabilities compare with each other? Since we have the mean of both of them are exactly the same, since if the standard deviation of dataset 2 is greater than the standard deviation of dataset 1, it automatically implies that dataset 2 will have a greater variability compared to dataset 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and write it down. Um, since the standard deviation of dataset 2 is greater than the standard deviation of dataset 1, that basically means that dataset 2 will have a greater variability. Okay, remember, the greater the standard deviation, the greater the variability. So since dataset 2 has a greater standard deviation, it automatically follows that it's going to have a greater variability compared to dataset 1 because they have exactly the same mean. Alrighty, so if you take a look at the options that we have right here, option 1 says dataset 1 has greater variability. That's incorrect, because if it did, then we'll have a scenario where sigma 1 will be greater than sigma 2, but that's not the case. Dataset 2 has the greater variability. Absolutely, this is automatically true because dataset 2 has a greater standard deviation. All right, let's